A few days before Christmas in 1995, the pilots of an American Airlines Boeing 757 wound up lost over the Andes Mountains in South America. Under pressure to make it to the airport quickly, they began to make mistakes. What started out as a simple lapse in judgement quickly snowballed into a series of critical errors, each one compounded by the one before it. In a few short minutes, these mistakes would result in the deaths of nearly everyone on board. Air crash documentaries often say that such and such an incident sparked a change in the aviation industry, but American Airlines Flight 965 is truly one of the few crashes which have had this effect. In this episode, we'll explore exactly why a stellar crew flying a state-of-the-art aircraft for one of the best airlines in the world made so many crucial mistakes. This is a story about the interaction between man and machine, and about the limitations of flight training. Above all, however, it is a story of human psychology. This is the story of American Airlines Flight 965. American 965 departed Miami International Airport in Florida at 25 minutes to 7 in the evening on December 20th, 1995. It was bound for Cali, the third most populous city in Colombia. On board were 155 passengers and 8 crew. Almost all of the passengers were first and second generation immigrants returning to their families in Colombia for Christmas. Dozens of them were children, many of whom would be seeing their parents' home country for the first time. Each of the flight attendants was also Colombian and had been awarded the trip home by American Airlines so that they too could see their families for Christmas. The flight had actually departed 2 hours behind schedule because heavy snow in the northeast of the United States had caused nationwide air travel delays. Now that the flight was underway, the crew were eager to make up time en route. In command of the flight were Captain Nicholas Tafuri, 57 years old, and First Officer Don Williams, 39 years old. Again, air crash documentaries often like to make a big deal of the experience of the crews involved, but in this case, a big deal is warranted. Before joining American Airlines, Captain Tafuri had served for several years in the US Air Force, including as a reconnaissance pilot in the Vietnam War. He joined American Airlines in 1969, and since then had amassed more than 13,000 flight hours, over 2,000 of which were in the 757. His safety record remained unblemished in all this time. He received excellent marks in training, and he was remarked on as an exemplary pilot by all who flew with him. His company records contain numerous letters from passengers and company employees who remarked on his performance. Tafuri had flown into Cali on 13 occasions before this flight. First Officer Don Williams' record was similarly outstanding. He had almost 6,000 flying hours under his belt, over 2,000 of which were on the 757. Before joining American in 1986, he had flown fighter jets in the US Air Force, where he also served as an instructor. In 1985, he was named Air Force Instructor of the Year. He was described by colleagues as professionally competent and appropriately assertive as a flight crew member. Williams had not flown into Cali before, but he had flown to other destinations in South America. I stress all of this experience because it makes the events which follow even more perplexing. In fact, the pilot's behaviour was deemed by some to be so out of character that a recent documentary has explored the possibility that exposure to toxins in the 757 cockpit had rendered them mentally incapacitated. For reasons we'll go into, I don't consider this a likely explanation for the accident, but we'll return to this theory towards the end of the video. The aircraft being used for this flight was a Boeing 757, a modern aircraft in 1995 with an excellent safety record. American Airlines used the 757 for almost all of its Latin American routes, in part because its technological sophistication provided an additional margin of safety. The 757 had a glass cockpit with all of the most modern navigational equipment, including a global geographic database and GPS technology. These were useful in South America, where infrastructure was often poor, and where controllers, with their limited English, were of little help. American Airlines considered their South American operations to be so much more hazardous than the rest of their routes that pilots who flew there also received special training on the dangers and demands of operating in the continent. This training was not even required by law, but American Airlines considered that it was necessary. The introduction to the guide pilots were handed out contained the following guidance. Flights into Latin America can be more challenging and far more dangerous than domestic flying or the highly structured North Atlantic European operation. Some Latin American destinations have multiple hazards to air operations, and air traffic control facilities may provide little assistance in avoiding them. En route and terminal radar coverage may be limited or non-existent. Mountains, larger and more extensive than anything you've probably ever seen, will loom up around you during descent and approach, and during departure. Communications, navigation, weather problems, and air traffic control philosophy peculiar to Latin America may conspire with disastrous consequences. As if this wasn't ominous enough, the introduction went on to say, "There are many hazards in this environment, but the greatest danger is pilot complacency. From 1979 through 1989, 44 major accidents involving large commercial aircraft occurred in South America. Of these 44 accidents, 34 were attributable to pilot error, or were pilot preventable with proper situational awareness." Given their excellent records, Captain Tafuri and First Officer Williams should have been perfect for the job. However, as we'll come to see, even the best pilots are still human, and the threats posed by flying into Latin America were primarily threats to weaknesses in human psychology. For the first 2.5 hours, the flight progressed as normal. Shortly before 9:30 that night, as they were about to begin their descent, the pilots began briefing their arrival into Cali. Their plan was to carry out an ILS approach to runway 01, which involved flying down a valley, past the airport, and then doing 180-degree turn to line up with the runway and land. This approach would involve them flying directly between two mountain ranges, which ran north to south. To the west, on the right-hand side of the aircraft, the mountains averaged around 6,000 feet, whereas to the east, they averaged 12,000 feet, with many peaks stretching far higher than that. In the dark, the pilots had no way of seeing these mountains. The only way they could stay on the right flight path was by following a series of radio beacons down the middle of the valley. Normally, air traffic control would have been able to keep an eye on the flight and alert the pilots if they had veered off course. But 3 years previously, a terror group had blown up the radar installation at Cali. This meant that the controllers had to rely on position reports from pilots to track the aircraft in their airspace. If any aircraft strayed off course, or didn't report their position accurately, air traffic control would simply have no idea where they were. For this reason, the pilots of American 965 had to navigate without the last line of defense of air traffic control. In the dead of night, as they began their descent, they had to rely entirely on their navigation instruments to fix their position. In a modern aircraft like the 757, however, this should not have been a problem. The plan was to fly first to a waypoint called Tulua, which was situated 61 kilometers north of the airport, then to another waypoint called Roseau, which was located just to the north of the runway. From there, the pilots would circle around and fly an ILS approach to runway 01. At just after 9:30, Captain Tafuri contacted Cali Approach Control.
Buenas noches, Senor. American 965, leaving 230, descending to 220. Go ahead, sir. The distance DME from Cali? The DME is 63.
DME stands for Distance Measuring Equipment, and it enables pilots to determine how far they are from radio beacons whose frequencies they have tuned to their navigation radios. This distance is displayed in the cockpit, here. When Captain Tafuri said he was 63 DME from the Cali beacon, which is about 120 kilometers, he would have been reading it from this display. The adjacent dial, known as the ADF, or Automatic Direction Finder, displays the direction to the beacon. Throughout their approach, the pilots would be making intensive use of these instruments, as well as the navigation display, which displays all of this information in map format. The controller then cleared them for the approach into Cali.
Roger, is cleared to Cali via war. Descend and maintain 15,000 feet. Altimeter 3002. No delay, expect for approach. Report Tulua via war.
VOR stands for Very High Frequency Omnidirectional Radio Range. It's a common type of navigation beacon which pilots can tune into using their onboard navigation radios. The controller was asking the pilots to report when they passed the Tulua VOR, because without radar, he had no other way of tracking the aircraft. All was well in the cockpit at this point. The atmosphere was calm, and the pilots were ahead of their aircraft, in the sense that they knew what the next steps were to be over the coming minutes. This order would soon break down, with disastrous consequences. All of this started with a simple misunderstanding. When the captain read back the instruction from air traffic control, he said,
Okay, understood. Clear direct to Cali via war. Report to Lua and altitude 15, that's 15,000. 3002. Is that all correct, sir? Affirmative,
said the controller. It wasn't that the pilots misheard anything the controller said. Their readback was correct, and the controller confirmed this. But the lack of familiarity with radio phraseology in South America meant that they misunderstood something subtle but important. In the United States, when a controller tells a pilot that he is cleared to a certain beacon, that means he is cleared directly to that beacon. In South America, however, when a pilot is cleared to a beacon, that doesn't necessarily mean that that beacon is their next stop, but rather that it is the end point of this particular clearance. there may still be other beacons on the way, which they must pass over first. In this case, when the controller cleared the pilots to the Cali beacon and asked them to report passing the Tallua beacon, what he meant was that they were cleared all the way to the Cali VOR, but that they would first have to pass over Tallua and report when they had done so that the controller would know where they were. The pilots were unfamiliar with this subtle difference, however. They believed they were being cleared directly to the Cali VOR, and that they didn't have to fly over Tallua, but only report when they were passing by it. The captain reached down to press the Direct To button on his flight management computer, and set his aircraft on a straight path to Cali, erasing Tallua and Roseau from the route. This small mistake had now set the stage for disaster. About a minute later, the controller offered the pilots a shorter route to the airport.
Sir, the wind is calm. Are you able to approach runway 19er?
This was a tempting proposition to the pilots. They were well behind schedule, and a straight-in approach to runway 19 would save them from having to circle to land in the opposite direction. However, they were already quite close to the airport, and a short-notice change of plan like this would increase their workload dramatically. If they took the controller's offer of a straight-in approach to runway 19, they would have to find and go over the approach charts to runway 19 and the associated radio frequencies, headings, altitudes, and missed approach procedures, enter all of this into the flight management computer, recalculate their required airspeeds, altitudes, and flap settings for each part of the approach, and start descending quickly, all while maintaining communication with air traffic control. This was a lot to do in a short period of time. They had already prepared all of this for runway 01 before their descent, so a change in plans at this point would put them under considerable pressure. However, both pilots were keen to shave off a few minutes from their already late flight. Captain Tafuri asked the first officer if he wanted to give it a try, and Williams said that while they'd have to scramble to get down, they could do it. Tafuri relayed this to the controller, saying that they would accept the approach to runway 19, but they'd need to be cleared to descend immediately. Now the pressure was on, and it was entirely self-imposed. First Officer Williams reduced the power and deployed the speedbrakes to help the aircraft descend quickly. The controller cleared them for the approach, saying,
American 965 is cleared to VOR DME approach to runway 19er, Roseau number 1 arrival, report to Lua VOR. Cleared the VOR DME to 19, Roseau 1 arrival, will report the VOR, thank you sir,
said Tafuri.
Report to Lua VOR,
the controller reminded him.
Report to Lua,
Tafuri confirmed. While the flight crew had put this pressure on themselves to, in the words of the first officer, scramble to get down, there was nothing stopping them from reassessing the situation and deciding that, actually, they'd be better off to do the original approach to runway 01, which they had already prepared for. Besides, Captain Tafuri had flown to Cali 13 times previously, and on these occasions he had mostly landed on runway 01. It was clearly the safer option, yet at no point did the crew reconsider their decision to land on runway 19. Ironically, the very fact that they were so busy preparing for this new approach is what stopped them from being able to step back and ask whether they could even make it. They put themselves under pressure and started to develop tunnel vision. They became fixated on trying to make this new approach work, and in doing so, became blind to all of the reasons that this was a terrible idea. But their fate was not sealed yet. Most rushed approaches end up in successful landings. A few more things had yet to go wrong on Flight 965. The controller had told the pilots to report when they had passed the Tallua VOR. This surprised them, because as far as they were concerned, they had been cleared directly to Cali. When the captain had entered Cali into his flight management computer and pressed execute, both Tallua and Roseau had disappeared from the route and had been replaced with a straight line directly from the aircraft's present position to Cali. Now the pilots were confused. They had to tell the controller when they were passing Tallua, but they had now lost track of where Tallua was. And what's more, they had no idea what the Roseau 1 arrival they had just accepted entailed. The Roseau 1 arrival is a standard arrival into runway 19 at Cali. If the pilots had had time to brief this approach, they would have known that this would involve them flying first to Tallua and then to Roseau, which was located just before the runway threshold. However, as they hadn't briefed the approach beforehand, they didn't know that Tallua was a part of it. They assumed that they could fly directly to Roseau. In the only acknowledgement during the whole approach that the time pressure they had put themselves under might make an approach to runway 19 impossible, Tafuri said,
The Roseau 1 arrival, we have time to pull that out?
As he said this, he pulled out the approach charts to runway 19 at Cali, and spotting the Roseau 1 arrival, said,
And Tallua 1 Roseau, there it is. Yeah, see, that comes off Tallua.
Finally, he'd realised that Tallua was the first beacon on the Roseau 1 arrival, and that that's why the controller wanted him to report passing it. However, during all of this rushing, he had lost track of where he was in relation to Tallua. He figured that it would be much easier to simply forget about Tallua and just go straight to Roseau. He got on the radio and said,
"Can American Airlines 965 go direct to Roseau and then do the Roseau arrival, sir?"
This request made no sense to the controller. The Roseau 1 arrival ended at Roseau. It didn't make sense that the crew wanted to do the arrival from Roseau. However, the controller's English was poor, and he wasn't able to express his confusion over the captain's strange request, so he simply said,
"Affirmative, take the Roseau 1 and runway 19er, the wind is calm." "Alright, Roseau to 19, thank you, American 965.
The controller then followed this up with an inconvenient,
"Thank you very much. Report to Tallua, 21 miles, 5,000 feet.
He still wanted the pilots to report that they had passed Tallua before going to Roseau, but the captain had other plans. He was simply going to ignore Tallua from here on. Unbeknownst to the pilots, they had already passed Tallua and were speeding down the valley towards the airport. Without radar, the controller had no idea that the pilots had passed Tallua either. Now the plan of the cockpit was to fly straight to Roseau and continue to the runway from there. The pilots began to set this up on their flight management computer, which contained a database of all the navigational aids in the world. American Airlines had chosen the 757 for its Latin American routes, in part because its advanced navigation and autopilot systems would improve the safety margins there. But, in an unfortunate twist, this ended up having the opposite effect on this flight. The captain entered the letter OR for Roseau into the flight management computer, and 2 pages of waypoints starting with the letter OR were displayed. Normally, the nearest one would be displayed at the top, but because of the way the navigation database had been set up, the first waypoint displayed was in fact a waypoint called OR, or Romeo, and not Roseau. This was located about 250 kilometers behind the pilots and to the left, near Colombia's capital city of Bogota. When the captain saw this letter OR at the top of the list, he believed that this was Roseau, because Roseau was identified by the letter OR on his navigation charts. Second, he knew from his experience with the computer that the closest beacon usually appears at the top of the list. And finally, both Romeo and Roseau had the same radio frequency of 274 kHz. Really, there was very little to indicate to Captain Tafuri that the OR he had selected was in fact Romeo, 132 nautical miles behind him. Except, there was one thing, and an important thing at that. When Tafuri pressed the key beside the letter OR in order to select it, a dotted line appeared on the navigation display in front of him, which previewed the path the plane would take to Romeo. If the captain had selected Roseau, this would have been more or less a straight line in front of the plane, but this is not what appeared on the display. Had the captain or the first officer looked at this display, they would have seen that the waypoint they had selected could not be Roseau, but neither of them confirmed this. There was one more chance the pilots had to notice their mistake immediately. As soon as Captain Tafuri pressed the execute button on the flight management computer, the plane began a sweeping left-hand turn towards Romeo. Neither pilot noticed that the plane had begun this turn. Without any reference to the horizon outside their windscreens, the only way they'd be able to see that they were turning was on the ADI, or Attitude Director Indicator. It is likely that the pilots were so preoccupied with setting up their aircraft for landing on runway 19 that they simply did not notice that they had entered a turn. The pilots were now about to get hopelessly disorientated. By ordering the plane to fly directly to the Romeo waypoint, they had removed all reference to Tallua, Roseau, and Cali from the navigation displays. They had also pointed themselves over 90 degrees to the left of where they thought they were headed. The pitch-black night obscured the towering mountains around them, and on the navigation display was nothing but blackness and a single magenta line stretching out over 100 miles. About a minute after the turn started, when the plane was heading east, the first officer lifted his head from the checklist and said,
Where are we? We're going out to..."
Realizing that they had lost track of where they were, the captain responded,
"Let's go right to Tallua first of all, okay?" "Yeah, where are we headed?"
responded Williams. The captain said, "Let's go right to Tallua," not realizing that Tallua was in fact now to his left. Neither he nor the first officer had noticed that the plane was now flying east, not south. In their rush to set up an approach to runway 19, the crew didn't realize that they had already passed Tallua. They thought they were north of Tallua, and that they had done a slight turn to the left, which a right-hand turn back to Tallua would rectify. When Tafuri entered Tallua into the flight management computer, this time he did check the navigation display. However, he didn't understand what it showed him. It showed that Tallua was to the left of the aircraft. Tafuri was expecting to see it in front of him, as he had still assumed that they were far further up north of the valley than they really were, and they were heading south down it, and that Tallua was still ahead of them. In his mind, this dashed line was nonsensical. It appeared to be taking them into the mountains to the west on their right. In reality, it indeed led directly back to Tallua. Wanting to double-check whether the waypoint he had tuned was indeed Tallua, he listened to the Morse code broadcast by the beacon. Indeed, it clearly said ULQ, which was the 3-letter identifier for Tallua.
Okay, I'm getting it,
he said, listening out for ULQ.
It just doesn't look right on mine.
The reason it didn't look right on his display was that he had no idea where his plane was. He was expecting to see Tallua straight ahead of him, but instead it was behind him and to his left. By this point, travelling at over 400 kilometers an hour, the plane had crossed over a mountain ridge and into another valley. All this time, the aircraft had been descending lower. Soon, it would be well below the mountain peaks surrounding it. First Officer Williams had now caught up with his aircraft and understood where the plane was in relation to Tallua.
Left turn, so you want a left turn back around to ULQ?
He began to turn left, heading back towards Tallua, but the captain interrupted.
No, hell no. Let's press on to... Well, we're press on to where, though? Tallua,
replied Tafuri.
That's right.
But it wasn't a right turn. The first officer had correctly identified this moments ago. Nonetheless, he began turning the aircraft to the right anyway. The pilots were still confused.
Where are we going? 1, 2, come to the right. Let's go to Cali first of all. We got f***ed up here, didn't we? Yeah. Go direct CLO. Come to the right now. Come to the right now.
The crew were hopelessly lost. They were still descending at 2,700 feet per minute, with their engines on idle and the speed brakes fully extended. Despite their confusion over where they were while in the middle of a mountainous area, they were still committed to getting down quickly so that they could make an approach to runway 19. Their decision to ignore Tallua and go straight to Roseau was in direct contradiction with the training they had received from American Airlines, which told them that in South America it was extremely dangerous to deviate from the published standard arrival routes. The crew had no idea that while they were trying to fix their location, they had crossed over into a parallel valley. A mountain range now lay between them and the airport. They tuned their navigation radios to the Cali beacon, CLO, and began heading for the airport. Captain Tafuri then contacted air traffic control.
An American 38 miles north of Cali, and you want us to go to Tallua and then do the Roseau to the runway, right? Runway 19?
This seemed strange to the controller. 2 minutes earlier, the pilots had told him they were 38 miles from Cali. How were they still 38 miles away? The answer, of course, was that the pilots had turned away from the airport since their first position report, and had only now turned back towards it. The controller's English was not good enough for him to be able to express this concern, however, so he simply said,
You can land runway 19er. You can use runway 19er. What is your altitude and the DME from Cali? Okay, we're 37 DME at 10,000 feet. Roger, report 5,000 and final to 11, runway 19er.
The captain turned to the first officer and said that they were heading in the right direction. But this was only slightly true. They were heading towards Cali, but not from the north, as they should have been. Wanting to get them back on course, and heading directly south towards Cali, the pilots turned to the right. They agreed to forget about Tallua and to head directly to Roseau, which was on the extended centre line of runway 19. Meanwhile, the controller was becoming increasingly concerned about the crew's strange transmissions. He called them again.
965 altitude? 965, 9,000 feet.
Wanting to get a sense of whether they were too low given their distance, the controller said,
Roger, distance now?
In the cockpit, the ground proximity warning sensor detected the rapidly rising mountainside beneath the plane and warned the pilots.
Oh shit.
First Officer Williams immediately disconnected the autopilot, shoved the throttles to maximum power, and pulled the plane into a sudden climb. This was a violent maneuver. Everyone on board the plane was pushed into their seats as the engines roared and the plane started shuddering.
Pull up, baby,
shouted Tafuri. First Officer Williams was keeping the plane on a knife edge. He was climbing as fast as he could, keeping the aircraft just above stall speed. In its rapid climb, the speed started to drop, and the stick shaker activated, sensing an impending stall.
It's okay,
he shouted.
Okay, easy does it,
said Tafuri. For a moment the stick shaker stopped, and Williams said,
Nope,
and pulled back further on the controls.
Up, baby,
shouted Tafuri.
More.
He was desperately watching the radio altimeter as the plane's height above the mountain drew ever closer to zero. The mountainside was rising more steeply than the plane could climb.
Up.
The plane then slammed into the side of the El Diluvio mountain. It ploughed through trees, breaking apart as it went. Most of the debris was catapulted up over the top of the mountain and began tumbling down on the other side before finally coming to rest. The impact killed nearly everyone on board instantly, including both pilots. Rescue teams were dispatched to the mountains shortly after the controller lost contact with the aircraft, but it took them until sunrise to finally locate the plane, almost 9 hours after it had crashed. Just 5 people survived the crash, one of whom died soon after reaching the hospital. With 159 people dead, this was the worst air disaster in Colombian history, and the second worst crash in American Airlines history. Investigators from the Colombian Civil Aviation Authority got to work immediately. The question they were faced with was how modern passenger aircraft, operated by one of the best airlines, and in this case one of that airline's best crews, end up so far off the correct approach course. They received their answer pretty much in its entirety when they listened to the cockpit voice recorder recovered from the crash. This revealed the confusion in the cockpit in the flight's final minutes. After an extensive investigation, the final report into this accident concluded that the flight crew's loss of situational awareness during the approach to Cali was the primary cause of this crash. This all started when they accepted air traffic control's offer of a last-minute runway change and began rushing to set their aircraft up in time for landing. When the captain entered the letter OR into the flight management computer, he made 2 key errors. First, his decision to fly to Roseau and ignore Tuluá was against the training he'd received from American Airlines, which required crews operating in South America to stick rigidly to published approach procedures. Second, when entering the letter OR into the flight management computer, Captain Tafuri didn't confirm that he had selected the correct waypoint either with his first officer or by looking at the map display in front of him. Investigators concluded that these lapses were likely a result of the self-imposed time pressure the pilots were under to make a rapid approach to runway 19. This time pressure gave the pilots tunnel vision and led to them repeatedly trying to locate the Tuluá beacon, all while they were descending into a mountainous area miles off course. If they had taken a step back to examine their situation, they would have been able to see the perilous position they had put their aircraft in, and would have had the presence of mind to climb back up to a safe altitude to get their bearings. Investigators also noted that the flight crew's trust in the plane's highly reliable flight management computer had probably made them less likely to check that their inputs into it were correct. In older aircraft, the captain would not have accidentally pointed the aircraft towards Bogota, as he would have navigated to Roseau by tuning its radio frequency and confirming its direction and distance. He would also likely have discovered the true location of Tuluá by similar means. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, American Airlines pilot training on FMS-equipped aircraft encouraged pilots to use the automation to the greatest extent possible. This led to a culture of blind, or let's say partially sighted, adherence to the outputs of the flight management computer. Pilots were taught that if they followed the Magenta line, they would stay out of trouble. Pilots who learned to fly during this time would later be called Children of the Magenta, by the now late Warren Vanderberg, a flight instructor at American Airlines. While Tafuri and Williams were experienced pilots who had flown far less automated aircraft than the 757, they nonetheless would have grown used to the reliability and comfort of this more sophisticated aircraft. Over time, as their trust in the computer increased, they may well have become less vigilant in their monitoring of it. On the night of this crash, this reliance on the FMC led to the aircraft turning more than 90 degrees and heading east for over a minute instead of south, all without the flight crew realizing anything was amiss. As a result of this crash, and similar ones around the same time, pilot training has been changed such that the emphasis is now on using the level of automation which is appropriate to the situation, rather than simply always resorting to the highest level of automation. In the case of American 965, this would have meant that as soon as the pilots realized they were lost, they should have ignored the flight management computer and put the aircraft into a climb before getting their bearings using their basic navigation radios, charts, and their compass. This simple change would have averted the entire accident and the loss of 159 lives. However, one of the most tragic and ironic conclusions of the report is that pilots cannot be expected to recognize that they have lost situational awareness, because in the stressful high workload environment during which situational awareness is most likely to be lost, the very stress that pilots are under prevents them from realizing that they have lost situational awareness. This means that pilot training to combat this cannot just focus on enhancing situational awareness. It must also focus on training pilots to not become task saturated in the first place. Finally, there was one last thing investigators identified which the pilots could have done to save the aircraft. When the ground proximity alarm sounded, indicating that a collision with terrain was imminent, the first officer correctly carried out the terrain escape maneuver as per American Airlines training procedures. However, one critical thing prevented the aircraft from climbing as quickly as it could: the speedbrakes. These had been deployed by the first officer when he initially accepted the approach to runway 19 in order to slow the aircraft down during its descent, and they remained extended up until impact. American Airlines' procedure for the terrain escape maneuver did not require pilots to retract the speedbrakes. However, investigators concluded that if either of the pilots had done this within the first second of initiating the terrain escape maneuver, they would likely have cleared the mountain. The final report into this accident recommended that aircraft manufacturers consider implementing a system whereby speedbrakes automatically retract when maximum thrust is applied. This system was already in place in a number of Airbus aircraft at the time, including the A320, A330, and A340. But to this day, only Boeing's latest aircraft, the 787, has adopted this feature. At the start of this video, I mentioned a documentary film entitled American 965, which argues that toxic fumes in the 757 cabin were the likely cause of the pilot's confusion on this night. The film argues that given how experienced the crew were, and given their excellent flying records, it's highly unlikely that the causes described in the accident report were sufficient to lead to a crash. In my videos, I tend to stick to the final reports and don't bring my personal opinion into it. However, in this case, I'm happy to go out on a limb and say that this strikes me as highly implausible. The history of aviation is littered with crashes in which excellent crews made very human mistakes and ended up causing the deaths of hundreds of people. It is far from inconceivable that the flight crew on this night, outstanding as they were, succumbed to time pressure and a host of other known psychological biases and lost situational awareness. Incidents like this have played out many times before, and there are no reasons to suspect that this time was any different. There was one final piece of technology which could have prevented this accident. This is known as EGPWS, or Enhanced Ground Proximity Warning System. Rather than just using the radio altimeter to detect terrain below the aircraft, which is limited by the fact that it can only see below the plane and not in front of it, the enhanced GPWS uses GPS to track the position of the plane against a global terrain database. It displays high terrain in colour on the pilot's displays, and can predict a collision more than a minute in advance. The pilots of Flight 965 had only 12 seconds warning. As a result of this crash, adoption of EGPWS became mandatory in the US in the year 2001 for all aircraft with more than 6 passenger seats. This technology makes similar accidents far less likely, and the number of accidents classified as CFIT, or Controlled Flight into Terrain, has dropped precipitously in recent years, largely as a result of the widespread adoption of this technology. If you've been on a plane sometime in the last 20 years, that means your journey was made safer as a direct result of the lessons learned from American Airlines Flight 965. Special thanks to the Green Dot Patreon and YouTube members for helping to make this video possible. If you'd like to help the channel grow and get some cool perks like early access to new videos, you can do so by tapping on the links here on screen. I'd especially like to thank Joey, Andrew Scheiskelov, Anthony Whistler, Antelope Honey, E-Tops, and Gar Farrell for their very generous contributions. I hope you enjoyed this video, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next week for another episode.